For a while now, I've wanted to talk about the Cars movies by Pixar. Well, to be honest, I mostly just wanted to talk about the second one and the third one, but then I realized it'd be weird if I just skipped the first one and talked about both the sequels, especially since there's a pretty good chance I'll end up talking about every Pixar movie eventually anyway, so here I am, starting with the first one. Now, the main reason that I wasn't as interested in talking about the first Cars movie as the sequels isn't necessarily because it's a bad movie, it's because it's not a bad movie, nor is it a great one either. Cars is the closest any Pixar movie has ever come to just being average.
Alright. I said, alright.
Actually, you probably could call it average. It's about a 7 out of 10 in my opinion. Although, like, a 6 out of 10 is kind of the baseline for what I'd call average, if you know what I mean. Anyway, most of the time, Pixar movies, I end up rating at least an 8 or higher, or a 3 or lower. There's almost none that fall right here in this middle zone like Cars does. Well, except Luca, which is a 4 out of 10, sorry Luca fans. It's a little bit mediocre in my opinion. The villain's pretty good though, not gonna lie. Anyway, Cars is just a movie that doesn't succeed as well as some other Pixar movies, and just doesn't have those same strengths that those other movies like, you know, Toy Story, Inside Out, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, etc., just do better than this movie. But it also isn't like bad, as I've been saying. Like, it definitely has certain flaws that I will point out in this video, but it is a perfectly watchable movie. And it even has some pretty nice highlights that I'll also mention in this video. But it's also just kind of a weird movie to me. Like, let me explain. The world building of this movie isn't all that, if you know what I mean. It's pretty much just the real world, but everything's been carified. Like, all the world building that doesn't have to do with Radiator Springs specifically is literally just, look at this thing that you know from the real world. Here's how we carified it. Wow. And is generally played off as a joke, or just a bit of visual humor, I suppose. Really, only Radiator Springs is the only bit of world building that actually matters in this movie, and it's an alright location. It's pretty iconic, but it's not like a top-tier, amazing film location of all time kind of situation. It is, after all, a town in the middle of the desert.
We're nowhere.
So it can only be just so visually interesting, if you know what I mean. The backstory that I'll get into more later is nice, and does add a little bit more depth than just a town in the middle of the desert. But at the end of the day, it's not the kind of location, or world in general, that is going to really pull me into a movie. So these Cars movies really have to do something more to actually engage me. You know, the plot, the characters, the emotional moments, the comedy, etc. That stuff has to actually be like on point, or else for me, the movie is just not going to grab my attention. Now, the next thing that I would like to point out is Lightning McQueen himself, the protagonist of the film. He's just okay. I don't dislike Lightning McQueen as a character, but he is nowhere near the list of my favorite characters in film, or even favorite characters in Pixar films. He's got good voice acting from Owen Wilson, and I suppose there's a nice character arc that he goes through over the course of the movie. It's nothing particularly special, just your usual stuck-up character has to discover the virtue of humility, which has been done before and also done better since this movie. Thor 1 fans rise up in the comments. Underrated MCU film. I also do think that Lightning McQueen's character arc may not have the best pacing to it. You know, it's mostly fine, but there's a couple parts about it that I think are slightly rushed. After all, he is only in Radiator Springs canonically for a couple of days. You see, Lightning McQueen is stuck up for quite a while. But then, like, basically, he loses the race with Doc Hudson, and then suddenly, he basically just starts being nice to everyone. Like, sure, a little bit hesitantly at first, but I do feel there's maybe a little bit of progression that's being fast-tracked here to get him to the final point where he's at near the end of the movie. Like, everything about his character arc works, don't get me wrong, it's just that it happens a little bit fast for my taste. And I think part of the problem too may also be the fact that the other characters who he interacts with in this movie, say for Mater and Doc Hudson, are just not that interesting in my opinion, which is another one of my critiques. Just the fact that there's so many side characters in this movie, like so many side characters, but just absolutely none of them except Lightning McQueen, Mater, or Doc Hudson really leave any impression at all. It's basically just the protagonist, the mentor character, and the comic relief, and everyone else just kind of feels like they're thrown in cause, you know, reasons. We gotta fill up this town with people somehow. And once again, I just want to say it's not that these are unlikable or bad characters, they're just there kind kind of characters, if you know what I mean. Part of me does wonder if, many of these characters were created specifically so that they could sell toys of them. Okay, now let's dive into some of the more specific details of the plot. I'm actually a pretty decent fan of the opening of this movie, like the opening race and showing us Lightning McQueen's selfish nature at first, as well as a few of the, subtle hints towards things to come, like how he doesn't like rusty cars being a foreshadowing of him eventually becoming friends with Mater and how he's changed over time, or the joke about him not needing headlights, massively backfiring on him when he gets separated from Mac. There's some nice details like that, and I do think it is very funny that he only ties the race victory because of sticking out his tongue. However, after this pretty solid start, we then get into what I can only describe as being one of the single most contrived sequences in cinematic history. That being how Lightning McQueen goes from on the freeway with Mac to in the middle of nowhere in Radiator Springs, forced to do community service. All in the span of one day, if even that. I mean, most of that time Lightning McQueen was knocked out. But anyway, I get, of course, that this sequence of events starts because of Lightning McQueen's selfishness of wanting to be the first one to arrive at the next race.
Just stopping off for a quick breather, kid. Old Mac needs a rest.
Absolutely not. We're driving straight through all night till we get to California. We agreed to it.
All night?
But there's technically no guarantee that he would have gotten lost if these four weirdos didn't show up and mess with Mac. And then secondly, once Lightning McQueen accidentally starts going the wrong direction, there's no guarantee that he would have gone so far if there hadn't also been another truck going that way. And then after that, when he drives past the police car character whose name I forgot, if he wasn't so old and run down, it wouldn't have sounded to Lightning McQueen like he was shooting a gun at him.
Maybe he can help me! He's shooting at me! Why is he shooting at me?
I haven't gone this fast in years. I'm gonna blow a gasket or something.
And he may not have ended up swerving into a fence. And if he hadn't swerved into a fence, then he wouldn't have been able to run into the statue, conveniently drive around it in an angle where he tries to back up that pulls it out and causes it to go flying, thus using the spike underneath it to destroy the road, only to end up conveniently tangling himself up. And of course the statue flies back to its original base, but I can chalk that up to comedic effect, so that's not actually a criticism. I actually do think it's pretty funny. But, that's a lot of stuff to happen just randomly, A couple points of that is slightly motivated by Lightning McQueen's selfishness. I suppose the fact that he didn't have headlights, for example, causing him to go the wrong way in the first place and think the other truck was Mac is part of his selfishness, in that I guess he thinks that he doesn't need them because he's above headlights or something. But I just can't quite get over, the amount of insane things that have to happen to get Lightning McQueen to the next part of the movie. It's not that it's completely unbelievable, it's just that it's noticeably forced. And after these events is when I would say the movie starts to slow down a bit. I don't have a ton of massive issues per se with the middle of this movie. It does its job getting Lightning McQueen from the start of his arc to the end of his arc, but it's always been the overall least interesting part of the movie to me. When in theory it should be the most interesting because it's all about his, character development, but it's just a little bit slow, I guess. Which I guess makes sense, because this is the part of the movie where the race car isn't racing. Haha, get it? I think the major issue is the one that I previously mentioned, just about how most of the side characters just aren't that interesting in my opinion. Because if they were more interesting, then I'd probably care more on a scene-by-scene basis than I actually do. And I think probably the biggest casualty of characters that I don't really care about is Sally, who's basically Lightning McQueen's girlfriend. And this has to be the most shoehorned in, rushed romance in any Pixar movie ever. Come to think of it, there's not really that many romances in Pixar movies. But yeah, it'd still be one of the most rushed romances in movies in general. That isn't catastrophically rushed to the point where it's ludicrous. Most of the attempts at these romance scenes are just a bit awkward in my opinion. But I guess you could say, since it is technically just a subplot, it doesn't really affect the movie that much if it's not that great, which is basically true. It's not a positive on the movie, but it's only a mild negative in my opinion. I suppose I should probably mention the two characters who I do actually like though, one of which is Mater. Now, Mater seems to get a decent amount of hate from people on the internet, mostly because of Cars 2, but honestly, I don't dislike Mater in any of the Cars movies, especially not the first two, in my opinion. I think he's a little bit meh in the third movie, but I think that's just because they were afraid to give him any more over-the-top jokes after Cars 2. But they ended up just kind of watering down his personality. But I guess I could talk more on that when I eventually talk about Cars 3. That's like one of the few things that I could actually point out as not being that good in that movie. But his role is minor anyway in that one. Here he of course serves as a lesson to Lightning McQueen to not judge people like he did before, especially rusty cars. And that he could actually make a friend, since of course earlier in the movie, when he's asked about what friends that he could call in to help, he can't name a single one.
They're giving you 20 tickets for the tiebreaker thing in Cali. I'll pass them on to your friends. You shoot me the names. You let Harv rock it for you, all right, baby?
Right, friends. Yes, there's,
Secretly, I'm very lonely.
So I think Mater fits really nicely into the themes of this movie, and I would say that at least 70% of his jokes are pretty funny, and then the other 30% are just okay. I can't think of any jokes with Mater that are like super unfunny or anything that completely flop. Maybe some people think there are, but I'd say he's pretty consistent as a comic relief character. All the bits about him being Lightning McQueen's lawyer are just comedy gold.
Man, I know this might be a bad time right now, but you owe me $32,000 in legal fees.
what?
You could also argue in a similar sense to the romance that his friendship with Lightning is a little bit rushed, but I think it's a bit more believable than the stuff with Sally. And of course the other character that I quite like is Doc Hudson.
Old people are the greatest. They're full of wisdom and experience.
Now, it is a pretty big coincidence that this professional racer just so happens to be in the one town that Lightning McQueen randomly ends up in through the most contrived sequence of events, but let's just put that aside and focus on how he ties into the plot, because he is actually very nice. Not like in that he's really nice to Lightning McQueen, because he's not, but I like that he has his own issues and his own character arc that he has to go through in this movie. From being a stubborn old man who's basically just given up, both on himself and hope for future generations. I like that at first, he doesn't even want to try to teach Lightning McQueen a lesson because he has so little faith in him as a person to actually improve or do things right. And he only really is motivated to teach him a lesson at first out of spite. But what I like is that he himself is surprised by Lightning's reaction. He thought for sure Lightning McQueen would simply just completely ignore his advice and not grow at all. But to see him actually learn a little bit of humility after, well, he got humiliated, and then continue to try over and over again to actually figure out the turn, even attempting to use Doc's advice at one point, is really, I think, what changes Doc's mind. But nevertheless, he still remains stubborn, being that all his life he's been burned by other people. After a single crash, they completely threw him out of racing, even though he still had a lot more racing he could have done and shown them. And it was specifically because of those younger, newer racers that this happened to him, which is why he's so spiteful of Lightning McQueen even when he doesn't really know who he is at first. The interesting thing too is that when Lightning McQueen discovers who Doc Hudson actually is, he actually really admires him, which I think is something that Doc just finds really hard to accept, because someone who's younger and essentially replaced him in the racing genre, the fact that they could actually like him and respect him seems to go against his idea that they all hate him and wanted to get rid of him, which is why he doesn't accept it at first and tries to get rid of Lightning McQueen anyway. But by this point, Lightning McQueen has really taken to Doc's lessons and actually started to become a better person. But it goes so much against how Doc sees the world that he doesn't really want his old perception to be changed. So he tries to forcefully get rid of Lightning McQueen by actually calling the people from the race to come and pick him up. And it's only after seeing how this affects everyone in their town, because of how much both Lightning had improved and how much joy and freshness, I guess you could say, he brought to this town, that they really did need him, and he really did need them. So it's one of those classic character only realizes they made the wrong choice after the fact and has to correct themselves, which I usually find to be a strong moment of writing in stories when it appears, such as in Toy Story 2, since it's a little bit more believable that the character would make the wrong choice first, then regret it and change their mind, rather than having already made up their mind and made the correct decision. Plus, it's more interesting storytelling-wise because we usually get to see the consequences of the wrong decision before things get set right. Although I'm not sure exactly what the consequences would be here, since I'm pretty certain Lightning McQueen would probably have always gone back to the races either way. I suppose if he stayed in Radiator Springs, maybe he would have given up racing altogether, which is a little bit unbelievable, but I don't know. It doesn't work quite as well as Toy Story 2 is all I'm saying. You know, where like Stinky Pete almost wins because of Woody's bad decision when Buzz shows up. Anyway, before I go on to the conclusion, there's one other important thing I should probably mention, which is the bit about the history of Radiator Springs, which is this movie's sort of emotional moment. Pixar movies, especially the earlier Pixar movies, pretty much all have at least one sort of emotional moment attempt. And here in Cars, they basically try to pull your heartstrings over the fate of the town of Radiator Springs itself, and how it once used to be this great town, but now is forgotten and separated from the rest of the world. I think there's a nice sort of lesson here in the sense that, you know, you could easily just go by in your life following the popular crowd and taking the fastest route, but along the way you'll miss a lot of the things that truly make life special. The people, the places, the connections. And it also is pretty fitting how Doc ties into Radiator Springs with his own story, being, you know, once this great person who's been forgotten by society and abandoned. So I think there's a nice connection between those two elements. However, at the end of the day, it is probably one of the weaker, emotional, heart-tugging scenes in any Pixar movie, because it is about a town. A fairly interesting town for the most part, but a town at the end of the day. And yes, the decline of the town did affect the inhabitants, but it's more about them not seeing customers and just being a little bit sadder than they used to be, which doesn't quite have the same emotional impact as other scenes in other movies do. I'm not by any means saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's not quite on the same level as most other Pixar movies, which is once again kind of the whole point of this video, with this being, in my opinion, the most average Pixar movie. It's got a very average emotional moment because of that. And, well, if you think I'm being a little bit too sour on this movie, then don't feel down, because we're at the ending now, which is actually my favorite part of this film. So I've pretty much only got positive things to say from this point onwards. I love the way that this final race mirrors the original, in the sense that we can see how much Lightning McQueen has improved while being in the same setting that he was at the beginning of the movie, but with completely different circumstances, such as the fact that as soon as all his friends from Radiator Springs show up, he now has a pit crew to replace the ones who he didn't appreciate previously, since he was in desperate need of a new crew after they quit, and he's got a proper coach now, which is what the King from Dynaco was telling him he needed earlier in the movie. He's learned new tricks instead of taking dangerous, bad maneuver risks, showing that he's improved his mindset as a racer too, rather than simply trying to just go fast. And of course, most importantly of all, his decision at the end not to win the race. After the villain of this movie, Chick Hicks, who I just realized I haven't really mentioned up to this point before. He's pretty good, by the way. Not like a top-tier Pixar villain or anything, but he's got some pretty funny lines, and he's pretty iconic. I like that he's just simply a jerk. No need to explain why. He's kind of just like what Lightning McQueen would be if he didn't change as a person, I guess. Which, now that I think about it, you can kind of see in the sense that Lightning McQueen has that sort of dream vision thing, where he imagines himself as being the one who owns Dynaco and getting movie deals and being super filthy rich and etc, etc. And then like later on in the movie, he has a nightmare where it's Chick Hicks who's in that same position he was in previously. But, you know, Chick Hicks' mindset doesn't change, unlike Lightning's. So you see what I'm trying to say? Anyway, I'm getting off topic. Chick Hicks tries to destroy the King and causes him to crash out into the dirt field with no chance whatsoever of winning anymore. And I think what makes it so powerful too is that Chick Hicks didn't even do this to win. He was gonna lose either way. He just didn't want to get third place. He didn't care if he was only moving up to second. It was still worth it to him to destroy the King in his last race. The sheer pettiness. And one thing that used to annoy me in the past was how Lightning McQueen could have easily won the race. I thought, why doesn't he just cross the finish line and go back and save the King? But as time has gone on, I've realized it was never about winning the race. After all, Doc Hudson did say, they're just cups.
Look at those trophies.
You look. All I see is a bunch of empty cups.
Which is what Lightning McQueen also repeats after the race.
You just gave up the piston cup. You know that?
Ah, this grumpy old race car I know once told me something.
It's just an empty cup.
But also, it's about making a statement, both about who he is and who he isn't. He let Chick Hicks win the race and went back to save the king and allow him to properly finish his last race because he realizes that people are more important than popularity or filthy riches or any other artificial, unimportant thing. He's making a statement to the people that the only reason Chick Hicks won this race is because he was a jerk. And because Lightning could have so easily won, everyone in the crowds knows that he's the true victor who should have won. So he doesn't lose any respect from the people, or really any popularity either, because they recognize that it was a choice here. He wanted to show how empty and hollow Chick Hicks' worldview was, that if he's willing to stoop this low to attack people just to get an empty victory, that just isn't who he is. Not anymore, anyway. And it's a perfect way to finish out his arc in this movie, in my opinion. And with all that, my conclusion on this movie is that it is a movie that exists, with a pretty good opening and a pretty good closing, but some so-so parts in the middle. Overall, I could easily sit down and watch through the entirety of Cars, but I'm not exactly going to be excited at the thought of doing so. It's the kind of movie that you watch maybe once every, 4 years or something. At most. Just when you're on the verge of thinking, it's been a while since I last saw that movie. But it's not the kind of movie you want to watch like every year, or even every other year in my opinion. Which kind of makes it odd to me that this is one of the most rewatched movies on Disney+. Like, why? Do people just really like Cars? Like, not the movie, but Cars, literally speaking. The ones you drive around. Is that why? Anyway, let me know what you guys think of this movie in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons harder than Lightning McQueen smashed up the road when he first arrived in Radiator Springs. And lastly, I have to give a big shout out and thank you to all my patrons and channel members who help me in an extra way to support this channel, and I definitely really need it. Early videos on Patreon, by the way, if you subscribe, as well as your name up here in the credits, which channel members also get. Well, I guess you could check out this playlist right here to see more of my Pixar-related videos, if there's some you haven't seen yet there and you're interested in that. Or you could check out whatever video this is that YouTube has decided to recommend to you. But, either way, the most important thing to remember is to always be iconic.